If anyone breaks formation, it will dishonor General Smith's legacy. That's what Commander Wilson warned before the ceremony began. But when the Medal of Honor appeared, one elderly veteran stepped forward with something unexpected, leaving the entire Pentagon stunned. The polished marble floors of the Pentagon Memorial Hall reflected the solemn gathering like a still pond. Richard Graham stood motionless, his 70-year-old frame surprisingly straight despite the slight stoop of his shoulders. His faded dress uniform hung loosely on his thin body, ribbons and badges telling stories of battles long past. The morning sun filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the ceremonial space. A chill lingered in the air, unseasonable for late April, yet fitting for the occasion. Thin wisps of fog had clung to the Washington Monument earlier that morning, as if the city itself mourned the passing of General James Smith. By 8 a.m., the hall had filled beyond capacity. Cabinet members and diplomats occupied the front rows, solemn-faced in dark suits. Behind them stretched a tapestry of humanity. Young officers standing rigidly at attention, veterans with weathered faces and misty eyes, family members clutching program booklets. Richard kept his gaze fixed forward, his breathing measured beneath his metal-adorned chest. 30 years of military service had perfected his ability to remain motionless for hours, his face betraying nothing of the thoughts stirring beneath his weathered exterior. Even today, perhaps especially today, his discipline would not falter, or so everyone thought. From somewhere inside the hall, the military band began playing low, mournful notes that seemed to vibrate through the very marble beneath their feet. The crowd stilled. The procession was beginning. That morning in the preparation room, Commander Wilson had addressed the honor guard with unusual solemnity. The gray-haired officer moved slowly between the rows of servicemen, his voice low but penetrating. "Today you carry 200 years of tradition on your shoulders," he'd said. "The eyes of the nation will be upon us. In your stillness, they will see our military's resilience. In your discipline, its strength." Wilson had stopped directly in front of Richard, studying the old veteran with narrowed eyes. Something to say, "Graham?" "No, sir," but deep inside his chest pocket. Richard felt the weight of the letter pressing against his heart like a stone. Richard Graham had never been the type of man people noticed, except when they needed to. At 70, his once imposing frame had diminished, leaving a thin, stooped figure with hands spotted by age and a face mapped with wrinkles. Yet his pale blue eyes remained sharp, missing nothing, betraying nothing. Born to a watchmaker in rural Pennsylvania, he had grown up surrounded by precision. His father's workbench, covered with tiny gears and springs that measured life in careful increments, had been his first classroom. "Everything matters," his father would say, magnifying glass pressed to his eye. "The space between seconds is where craftsmanship lives." This philosophy followed Richard through school, through Vietnam, through 30 years of military service. While other recruits struggled with the military's demands of perfection, Richard absorbed them naturally. His record had been spotless. Never late, never out of uniform, never questioning orders. Graham's like a blueprint for the rest of them. His commander once remarked, "If I could clone him, I would." Only his wife had known that Richard kept a small wooden clock, his father's first creation, beside his bed, and only she knew that sometimes, late at night, he would wind it carefully before kneeling to pray. It had started with a child's cry 5 years earlier. Richard had been volunteering at the Veterans Affairs Hospital when he'd heard it, a high, terrified wail cutting through the murmur of the waiting room. A small boy, maybe 4 or 5, separated from his mother in the crowded space. Protocol demanded Richard stay at his information desk, call security, maintain visual surveillance. Instead, he moved across the room and lifted the child above the crowd until a frantic mother pushed through. A minor breach, quickly corrected, barely noticed, except by General Smith, there for a routine visit. 2 days later, a military aide had appeared at Richard's modest apartment with a message. "General Smith requests your presence." Richard had followed the aide to the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors to a modest office where General Smith sat not behind his desk, but in a simple chair by the window. Afternoon light streamed in, catching the dust motes in the air. "Sir," Richard had said, standing at attention. "Sit, please." Smith replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his. His voice carried the slight rasp of age, but retained its distinctive command presence. When Richard hesitated, the general smiled. "It's not an order, it's a request." "You know why I asked for you?" the general inquired. "No, sir." Smith nodded toward security footage of Richard helping the child. "You left your post," Smith said. "Yes, sir. I apologize for..." Smith raised a weathered hand. "Why did you do it?" 2 nights before the ceremony, Richard had been eating his solitary dinner when a knock sounded at his apartment door. Standing in the hallway was Colonel Matthews. Stooped now with age, his hair bone white, his hands like paper maps of creased rivers. "A moment, Graham," the colonel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard stepped aside, allowing the older man to enter. "It's rather unusual," Matthews began, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard. But then, he was an unusual man. From within his coat, he withdrew a cream-colored envelope, sealed with a simple wax mark. No address, no formal insignia, just a single line in shaky handwriting on the back. For the man who once helped a child. He wrote several letters in his final weeks, Matthews explained. Most to family, to close friends. This one for you, he was quite specific about his delivery. "How did he know I would still be around?" Richard asked softly. "After all these years?" Matthews' lips curved in a gentle smile. He said, "Some men serve because it's their duty, others because it's their nature." The old colonel touched Richard's arm briefly. He knew which kind you were. Richard waited until he was alone, sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, before breaking the seal. The letter inside was handwritten on simple paper. No letterhead, no formal declarations, just words in the distinctive, slightly uneven script of an old man writing with an arthritic hand. "Richard," it began without preamble. "If you're reading this, I've gone to meet our Maker. Strange how we spend our careers preparing for death, yet still approach it like bewildered travelers without a map. I've been thinking about our conversation from years ago, about the boy in the hospital, about your brother in Vietnam, about rules and when to break them. Because in you, Richard, I recognize something rare. A man who serves not out of duty to an institution, but out of love for what that institution should represent. Those are the soldiers we need most, especially when no one is watching. The world will tell you that discipline means remaining still when everything inside you says to move. Sometimes that's true, but the greatest discipline is knowing when movement serves a higher stillness. If one day you find yourself torn between the letter of tradition and its spirit, remember this. I saw you, God sees you, and perhaps that is enough. When the time comes for my final honors, I will not hear your footsteps, but I will feel them, with respect and admiration. James. Richard read it 3 times, each reading slower than the last. His hand trembled slightly, not with indecision, but with the weight of certainty. The military band played Amazing Grace, the hymn General Smith had chosen years before, simple, plaintive notes rising above the gathering. Richard watched the slow progression of military leaders down the center aisle. Behind them walked the general staff, family members, longtime colleagues, their faces drawn with genuine grief rather than ceremonial solemnity. Among them, Colonel Matthews moved slowly, one hand resting on the arm of a younger officer for support. As he passed Richard's position, the old man's eyes lifted briefly, meeting the veteran's gaze for the slightest moment. Something passed between them, unspoken, invisible to cameras and onlookers, but undeniable. Permission, understanding, recognition. The Medal of Honor was carried forward on a velvet cushion, positioned at the center of the memorial display. General Anderson stepped forward, ready to begin the commendation. The crowd held its collective breath, prepared for the familiar rhythm of ancient military tradition. Richard's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly at his sides. The moment crystallized around him like ice forming on a still pond, sudden, silent, transformative. In 30 years of service, he had never broken formation, never disrupted ceremony, never placed personal impulse above protocol. Until now, his first step was precise, not hesitant but measured, the sound of his dress shoe striking marble ricocheted through the hushed hall. Those nearest him turned in confusion. Second step, halfway to the memorial now. A senior officer glanced up sharply, his reading momentarily forgotten. Third step, standing directly before the velvet cushion that held the Medal of Honor. The world seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the hall, every camera lens fixed on the elderly veteran who dared to move when movement was forbidden. With mechanical precision, Richard reached slowly into his breast pocket. The movement was so controlled, so ceremonial in its execution, that for a heartbeat it almost seemed planned. From within his uniform, he withdrew the letter, pale parchment against faded blue fabric. Then, in a motion that combined military precision with profound reverence, Richard bent one knee to the ground, a movement that clearly caused him pain, his aged joints protesting visibly. He placed the letter gently beside the Medal of Honor display, precisely beneath the general's photograph. His gloved fingers lingered for the briefest moment. "Until Valhalla, old friend," he whispered. The words weren't meant to be heard, just a private farewell, but in the perfect acoustics of the memorial hall, they carried to those nearest a final intimacy made accidentally public. He rose with difficulty, 3 steps backward executed with the same precision as his approach, his face composed once more into the mask of ceremonial stillness. The breach had lasted less than 30 seconds. Around him, reactions rippled through the ceremony like concentric waves. A young lieutenant crossed himself, though whether in shock or approval wasn't clear. Several generals exchanged glances of barely concealed alarm. From the diplomatic section, the German ambassador leaned toward her aide, whispering behind her hand. Yet no one moved to interfere. No security personnel stepped forward. The letter remained on display, its presence altering the ceremony in ways no one could have anticipated. Evening shadows lengthened across the Pentagon courtyard. The crowds had dispersed. The world's dignitaries had returned to their embassies and hotels. General Smith's Medal of Honor had been secured in its permanent display case. Richard sat alone in a small anteroom connected to General Anderson's office. No clock on the wall, no window to mark time's passage. He had been waiting for over an hour. The door finally opened. Not a secretary or aide, but Colonel Matthews himself, stooped with age but moving with the quiet authority of a man who had witnessed military transitions since the days of Vietnam. "They're ready," he said simply. Inside, 3 men waited around a small table. General Anderson sat with his hands folded atop a leather portfolio. Commander Wilson of the Honor Guard looked strangely diminished without his ceremonial uniform. Secretary Davis completed the triangle, his thin face illuminated by a single desk lamp. No recording devices, no formal charges read aloud. Just 4 men, and the weight of tradition between them. "I think we can dispense with preliminaries," Anderson began. "Your actions today were witnessed by approximately 2,000 people in the hall, and several million via broadcast." His tone wasn't accusatory, merely factual. "The question before us is not what you did, but why. I received a letter from General Smith," Richard finally said, "written before his death. It was delivered to me 2 days ago by Colonel Matthews." The old colonel nodded confirmation. "The difficulty we face," General Anderson finally said, "is one of competing truths. Military discipline is essential and must be maintained. Yet General Smith often reminded us that honor sometimes requires flexibility. This sets a dangerous precedent," Wilson frowned. "Only if widely known," Secretary Davis countered. "The specific circumstances," a personal letter from General Smith himself, "are unique enough to be contained." General Anderson studied Richard directly. "Do you believe military tradition allows for such personal gestures?" "No, sir," Richard replied honestly. "Tradition doesn't allow it, but perhaps sometimes tradition needs to be reminded why it exists in the first place." After a long moment, Anderson nodded almost imperceptibly. "We will take no formal action regarding today's incident. No public statement will be issued. But understand, Graham, what you did cannot become precedent." Richard understood the unspoken message. He would not be dismissed, but adjustments to his position would be necessary. The reassignment came 3 days later. A simple envelope slipped beneath Richard's door before dawn. No official ceremony, no public acknowledgement, just a typed notice bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. Effective immediately, volunteer Richard Graham is transferred from Honor Guard Division to the Military Archives. The Archives, the Pentagon's vast underground repository of history. Miles of shelves, millions of documents, centuries of secrets preserved in climate-controlled solitude. Tourists never saw it. Cameras never filmed it. The perfect place to tuck away a veteran whose face had flickered across the world's screens in an unprecedented moment of disciplined rebellion. Not punishment exactly, not exile, but definitely removal. Richard reported to his new post without complaint. His new supervisor, Dr. Evans, was a thin, dust-coated man who spoke 4 languages but preferred silence to all of them. "You'll assist researchers mainly," he explained, his voice as dry as the documents surrounding them. No bags permitted beyond the reading room. No pens, only pencils. One Tuesday afternoon, deep in the Vietnam War section, Richard noticed a young cadet studying documents with unusual intensity. "My grandfather served there," the cadet explained, noticing Richard's attention. Then, recognition dawned on his face. "Wait, you're him, the veteran who broke formation at General Smith's ceremony." Richard paused, caught off guard by the direct recognition. "Were you scared?" the young man pressed. "When you decided to move?" "No." "Why not? Everyone said it was forbidden." Richard studied the cadet's open, curious face. No judgment there, no agenda, just genuine wonder. "Because sometimes," he said finally, "the rules are meant to protect something precious. And sometimes the most respectful thing you can do is recognize when following them would cause harm instead." The cadet considered this, head tilted slightly. "My commander says rules are rules." "Your commander is mostly right," Richard replied. "But no rule is greater than the honor it's meant to serve." As the young man returned to his research, Richard continued shelving documents, his aged hands moving with practiced precision. Was Richard right to break formation at this sacred moment? Does true loyalty sometimes require breaking the very rules we've sworn to uphold? Respect each other in the comment below. We'd love to hear what you would have done in his position.